I'm glad to see so much active conversation. I promise there will be more opportunities for that, both throughout the weekend and even later today. So yeah, thanks so much for finding your seats again and getting ready for our next panel. Our last panel of the day. All right. So next up, we're going to have Climate and Environment 1, Part 2, coming later this weekend. And featured on this panel, we have Natalia Castillo from the University of Pennsylvania, Andrew Balaban from Hunter College, Maddie Keys from the University of Oklahoma, Eder Ruiz Sanchez from Swarthmore College, Katerina Portella from San Diego State University, and Jennifer Wybaraki from Syracuse University. So thanks everyone for your attention. As with our last panel, we'll have a Q&A session once we hear from all of our panelists. And with all of that said, Natalia, I'll hand it over to you.
Situated. I am Natalia Castillo, and I am representing the University of Pennsylvania. This past summer, I lived in Puerto Rico, and I was reporting on long-term recovery after Hurricane Maria. So to give kind of an overview of the kinds of writing that I was doing, my long-form piece was focused on the efforts by the Puerto Rican government to provide long-term climate-resilient housing to the most vulnerable residents of the island. And in that process, my field note has kind of taken on the life of writing about my experience kind of living through the worst parts of the climate crisis in Puerto Rico. As a Californian, beyond wildfires, it's very easy to kind of imagine the climate crisis as this impending crisis, but still on the horizon, whereas in Puerto Rico, it's very much the present reality. So to give some context on what the situation in Puerto Rico is like currently, in 2017, they experienced the devastating Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma, and since then, they have been struggling to kind of regain footing. Currently, it was one of the most warm and humid summers that they experienced, and they are facing a huge energy crisis because of their current electricity system. And as a result, the residents are facing peril every day as a result of the climate crisis. And one of the biggest challenges, and what my project focused on, was the discrepancy in short versus long-term recovery for an island like Puerto Rico that is facing the constant threat of hurricanes and even the occasional tornado, which I learned, and earthquakes as well. It is incredibly difficult to rebuild when you're constantly facing disaster. There are shrinking coastlines. The week that I left, a new hurricane hit, and media coverage was at an all-time high after Maria, but then there's a vacuum. And my kind of question was, what happens after? What happens in the long term? So to give a little bit more context on what the disaster was like after Maria, in 2017, they were first hit by a Category 5 Hurricane Irma, and then quickly after by Category 4 Hurricane Maria. And these hurricanes critically damaged the island's power grid and left residents stranded without clean water, food, or access to medical services. Speaking to family members and other residents, it truly became like a ghost town, according to them. You could go out into the streets and there were no lights, they had no access to food, and they were just uncertain of when aid would arrive. As a result, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. And due to a number of federal management shortcomings, the island's inhabitants struggled to receive aid in a timely manner. I remember sitting in my California home, hearing dispatches from my family members in Puerto Rico, unsure of when power would return for good, as I watched newsreels of the then president throwing paper towels into the crowd and kind of overall diminishing the crisis. After the hurricane, immediate aid came through FEMA, which was the Individuals and Households Program and the Individual Assistance Program. However, nearly 40% of applicants were denied because of land titling regulations, and this is kind of where my reporting comes in part. And this is the R3 program. So some of the persistent challenges that come with reconstruction is the informality. Puerto Rico was constructed largely on like an informal land titling kind of mechanism, and as a result, when federal aid arrives, it's really hard to keep track of whose land belongs to whom, like what is government land, and because of fraud, they're concerned about kind of like double dipping of funds, but also keeping track of where the money is going. However, there's just an accessibility problem as well. When aid arrives, sometimes like the funding applications are in English for a Spanish-speaking nation. And then as well with the specific R3 program that I've been looking at, the process is just incredibly lengthy. They can submit for funding immediately after the program opens, but then they'll spend almost 2 years waiting to hear back from these programs, and in the meantime, they're left to their own devices. So this was a quote from one of my residents who I spoke to. She says, "Yo nací aquí y me creí aquí," which means I was born here and I grew up here. I looked at one particular neighborhood in El Barriada El Polvorín in San Juan, which was constructed nearly at the beginning of the island's modern development. And the program specifically is called R3, Reconstruction, Repair, and Relocation. This program essentially aims to build long-term climate-resilient housing. To give you a sense of where this program sits in the funding kind of like landscape, but also the actual timeline, the FEMA relief arrived immediately after the hurricane, and then Puerto Rico started to roll out a long-term action plan. And then R3 was intended to focus more on long-term climate-resilient housing for low-income individuals on the island. However, only about half the applicants in the program have been serviced since 2019, nearly 5 years now, and these residents have either had to wait incredibly long time for the program to reach back out to them, or they have simply been denied. So I would like to just read an excerpt of these two individual stories in this one neighborhood. Under the baking Puerto Rican sun, a quaint home sits in wait. The bones, sturdy white concrete walls, are nestled in a plot of overgrown grass. Through the window panes, Lydia Cruz peers into the home. The structure, a modern gem in Barriada El Polvorín, San Juan, was constructed after Cruz's former home was damaged during Hurricane Maria in 2017. The house was built through Puerto Rico's Department of Housing, Reparación, Reconstrucción, o Reubicación program. However, for over 6 months, the home remained devoid of furniture and inhabitants. Essentially, in this neighborhood, there were two individuals. This is Lydia Cruz on the left-hand side, who both applied through this program, but they both waited for over a year to hear back. And then once their houses began to be constructed, their paths kind of diverged. One was able to go through the process relatively seamlessly, while the other was just left in the dark entirely. This is similar for many other applicants in the program. And as a result of the informality crisis, a lot of people are left to their own devices and as a result do their own reconstruction projects, which makes the communities even more vulnerable to hurricanes and natural disasters. I'm going to wrap up now, but these are just some photos from the field. I think one of the biggest impacts of this experience was realizing how real and how close the climate emergency already is. And I think these stories, because they've been overlooked by the media, it's easy to continue to imagine it as a crisis on the horizon. Thank you.
All right. Hello there. I'm Andrew Balaban. I'm from Hunter College, which is in New York City. And my project was going to Portland, Oregon, to look at their stormwater management systems. So I want to start off with the question of why is it important? Why should we care about it? And there's this idea that climate change could possibly exacerbate flood frequency and flood like flood occurrences, basically. So there's this research paper from Nature, the journal, and it looked at CMIP5 models, which are climate projection models, and it said that many areas of the United States might experience increases in these flooding occurrences. Now, it should be said that this is going off of models, and it's also not uniform, so there are going to be some areas of the United States that experience a decrease in flooding, possibly, and some areas that are more resistant to the effects of climate change. The Pacific Northwest, where I was, is possibly going to be one of them. They projected maybe a 67% increase in flood occurrences, flash flood occurrences specifically, under high emission scenarios, which is not like the highest they have. Some areas are 127% increases, but it's not great. So there's different approaches to managing stormwater. And looking at Portland is sort of an interesting case study. So in the 1990s, Portland had huge problems with combined sewer overflows, or CSOs. And this happens because when you have a combined sewer system, you have sewage and also stormwater runoff being handled in the same pipes and drains, and these usually go to a facility to be treated. But in events where there's high levels of rain, they can sometimes flood into a basin, and that can lead to all sorts of problems with pollution. It also, like when the stormwater is running down streets into pipes, it can pick up sediment, it could pick up oil, grease, etc. It's like maybe not a great system. So when there was all this rain happening in the 90s and all these combined sewer overflows, Portland actually got sued by a nonprofit, and this caused them to invest billions of dollars in a project called the Big Pipe, which is essentially a large pipe. There's one in East Portland, one in West Portland, and it's a series of pipes, really. And it's been relatively effective since its creation. These CSOs have decreased about 94%. But concurrently with the Big Pipe program, which was this huge infrastructure project, and it would be considered gray infrastructure, there was also these huge investments in green infrastructure and floodplain restoration. And that is a stormwater system that retains and stores stormwater on site, like where it falls, rather than funneling it into a basin, basically. So this can include bioswales, it can include rain gardens, it can include, eco roofs. There's all sorts of ways it can come about, but it's usually plants, soil, some way for water to drain into that. And it has various environmental benefits, especially if used alongside traditional gray infrastructure projects and investment in that, such as cleaner water, reducing load for traditional infrastructure. There's a number of things, especially because native plants can help clean the water so that it doesn't pick up oil and grease and other sorts of things you might not want in your rivers. And part of this was floodplain restoration. So I had on the previous slide a picture of a road that got flooded. This is Southeast Foster Road. There was a floodplain restoration plan called the Foster Floodplain Plan that essentially restored floodplains to sort of more their pre-development state. And it made it so that things like this don't happen really that often anymore. I haven't seen any instances since the early 2010s when the project was completed. And so when I went to Portland, what I was focusing on were the community level aspects of implementation and maintenance. It's actually really interesting. In Portland, 600 of these facilities, which is almost 20% of the green infrastructure facilities, this includes bioswales and also rain gardens on people's properties, are maintained by residents, which is something that surprised me through a program through the Bureau of Environmental Services called the Green Street Stewards Program. People maintain their own rain gardens, bioswales that are set up by the BES. So how do you get people involved? How do you get people interested? And that was kind of what I was looking at. This is actually a picture from a nonprofit that set up this street fair called Deep Pave. And they do a lot with green infrastructure, and especially they have like a very big volunteer program. I spoke with some of their volunteers, this one guy, Carlos Nunez, who's been volunteering there for 10 years, and he talked about how like it's sort of become like a big family sort of environment. And this is like a pattern I see over and over again when I'm talking to people there. And I guess the takeaways I have from this are that I think elements of Portland's culture can facilitate their success in green infrastructure. Portlanders are, they have a reputation of being kind of, weird. Sorry, Celeste, I know you're, yeah. I've yeah, but like this is a thing. So I talked to someone from the BES who used to work there called Maggie Skandarian. She said that like Portland, they've never met a tree they don't like. There's some people who worked in environmental services who she described as like the AOCs of stormwater management. So I thought that was like kind of interesting. But yeah, there's like the idea that a common saying you hear when you're in Portland is, the topics of conversation at a house party are beer, bikes, and bioswales, which, yeah, so there's this level of desire to have natural spaces within the city. And it's a very green city, and there's a big gardening culture, too. And this kind of helps facilitate green infrastructure. But challenges still persist for the agencies that are trying to create it, especially the Bureau of Environmental Services, which is having some staffing issues right now. So there's competing land uses. This actually didn't make it into my article that I wrote, but there was a hearing in Portland while I was out there where it was like, should we change the requirements for urban trees on large developments was basically the thing. And the idea is a lot of people in the green infrastructure space were fighting against it because that measure, because like the urban trees can have a lot of infiltration, they can store a lot of stormwater. But there's also the competing effect where Portland, has a homelessness problem. There's a lot of, housing shortage going on there. So cities have to deal with these sort of competing land uses. There's also maintenance concerns where you have these systems set up and then theoretically they're native plants, you don't need to take care of them, but in reality, you actually do. Especially, I went during the dry season, during the summer, and like a lot of them get overrun by grass, and then they sort of die out. So you need maintenance, and this largely happens at a community level, but there might be more investment needs there. And then, yeah, there's just more innovative visions for the future of stormwater management. I went to this building at the bottom here is the East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, and they've got like every sort of it's like a fever dream of the stormwater management world. Like they've got permeable pavement and like disconnected drains. It's really everything you'd want. So yeah, that's basically my presentation.
My name is Maddie Keys, and I am the reporting fellow from the University of Oklahoma. And for my project, I looked at the intersection of climate change and mental health for Greenland's native Inuit population. And my project called Surviving the Thaw, Greenland's Inuit Grapple with a Changing World. So when you think of climate change, a few images likely come to mind. That of swelling oceans, merciless wildfires, and stranded, starving polar bears. In fact, if you Google climate change, it is exactly these images that will surface. Add in the word Greenland, and you'll find pictures of melting ice and a country's landscape changing rapidly as a result. But there's something that you don't immediately see, and that's the people. Like many of you, I'm sure, I learned about climate change through numbers and scientific facts. In class, I was taught about the albedo effect and how just 1 degree Celsius can have drastic consequences for our environment. In the media, I read headlines detailing extreme weather events and billions of tons of ice melt pouring into our rising oceans. I first learned of Greenland within this context of climate change, but I was always curious about the stories behind the numbers. How are the people impacted by climate change, not only physically and economically, but emotionally? So, this summer, I traveled to Greenland to answer this question. Going from like over 100 degrees in Oklahoma to like 30 degrees in Greenland was quite a shock. There was also the midnight sun, which I had never experienced before. So I landed in there at midnight, but it looked like noon. Very glad I packed my eye mask, because otherwise I would not have gotten any sleep. But to paint you a little bit of a picture of Greenland, around 80% of the country is covered by ice. So the tiny population of 56,000 people mostly reside along the coast, primarily the west and the south. I spent my time between Nuuk, the capital city, and Kukortak, which is in the south. And let me tell you, it was a journey to get there. A bus, a plane, a train, boat, like everything to get from Nuuk to Kukortak. Full day, but it was quite the adventure. And Kukortak only has 3,000 people, which I come from a very large university, so it was very shocking to like just be there for 3 days and see people that were already familiar just from like walking down the street. I was like, oh, hi, I saw you yesterday. Anyways, but much of Greenland is above the Arctic Circle, where temperatures are climbing nearly 4 times faster than global averages. Even those who have only lived in Greenland for a decade have been able to see the changes to their environment. The sea ice has grown thinner and less stable, forms later in the year. The air feels warmer, they tell me, and the weather is more erratic, and many of the animals' migration patterns have changed. So fishing, hunting, and strong ties to nature have long defined the culture of Greenland's Inuit people, but that is all being undermined by the rapidly changing environment. So while I was in Nuuk, I was able to speak with Greenland's Fishermen and Hunters Association chairman, and we spoke through a translator. That was my first time using a translator, but it was kind of cool. Greenlandic sounds very beautiful in my opinion, but he was telling me about how hunters and fishers' livelihoods have been threatened by climate change and how their mental health has been affected as a result. So especially in the north, they rely heavily on the sea ice in order to hunt and fish. They take their dog sleds out, and so when the ice is too thin to go out or non-existent, they can no longer fish and hunt as they used to. Oops. Oh. Sorry. Messed it up. Oh, there we go. And so this past winter, I was told that for months they could not fish and hunt in Greenland's northernmost city. So they, the children's spokesperson in Greenland petitioned the government to assist families whose incomes were impacted by climate change, saying, "We are dealing with an emergency situation. It has reached the point where some families will soon no longer be able to feed their children." And then from a cultural perspective, frequent storms and unpredictable weather have made it difficult for Greenlanders to uphold some Inuit traditions, such as fishing and hunting. But really, it's more than that, too. Climate change threatens what for many is a place of healing. So in Greenland, there is a word that I feel like perfectly encapsulates the connection Greenlanders have to nature, which is called sila. It is used not only to describe the weather, but one's soul and state of mind. So nature and spirit are very connected. I spoke with a Greenlandic suicide prevention instructor named Arnarok, and she said nature is like a healing place. We understand the nature understands us. The only thing we can heal from now is being affected with climate change. So this is kind of the side of climate change that we don't really see, the impacts that can't be fully described with numbers and scientific facts. It's not just livelihoods in Greenland that are threatened by climate change, but ways of life. I spoke with mental health experts who said that the disconnect that they're feeling from their Inuit culture adds to the pile of risk factors that Native Greenlanders, or that affect Native Greenlanders' mental health. Though Greenland is the least densely populated country, it frequently has had one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Still, nearly everyone I spoke with shared a common sentiment, and that is the Inuit have survived centuries in the unforgiving Arctic, and they will survive this too. So not only was it important for me to, with my reporting, try to show the realities of their experiences with climate change, but also how they were reacting to it. They don't want to be seen simply as victims of climate change, but people who are actively responding to it. So, when the hunters and fishers weren't able to catch for months because of melting ice, the community raised money to help them feed their families. When Anurag noticed the high suicide rate in her community, she created a suicide prevention course and taught frontline workers how to have conversations about mental health. And when, as climate change makes it harder to practice traditions and pass on generational knowledge, a woman I spoke with named Inglis Olsen created a program that brought youth and elders on a camping trip to reconnect with nature and form intergenerational bonds. And that program is now being integrated into the kindergartens so that the children can have frequent intergenerational activities and time with nature. So kind of to sum up here, climate change is impacting the everyday lives of Greenlanders in more ways than I can list in the span of a few minutes. But strength and resilience are a part of their culture as well. And they're finding ways to support one another, even while their environment dramatically changes around them. And then I want to leave you just with one ask, and that's when you read about climate change or homelessness or the ongoing wars, pay attention to the statistics, but then think beyond them. They're not just numbers, they're experiences, and they're people. Thank you.
Everyone. Okay, my name is Eder. I'm a senior at Swarthmore, and this is my project. So when we think about climate change, images of melting icebergs, once in a millennia hurricanes come up to mind. We usually think about that. At the same time, the global scale of climate change makes it difficult to think about the local experiences, the local knowledges that are being affected by climate change. And what we see here is that climate change acts in fast and slow ways. And one of those slow ways is through droughts. And droughts carry a heavy weight on communities. And we can't necessarily characterize it because it's slow, but it does have a very big impact. So this summer, I spent time in San Lucas Ocotepec in el Estado de Mexico, which is a state surrounding Mexico City. It's also my family's hometown and also the land of the indigenous Masawa people. A lot of the people there are descendants or practicing indigenous people. And one of the ways in which they continue their culture is through cultivating maize or corn. And maize is really important because across Mexico, across Latin America, it's one of those staple crops that is really embedded into the culture. We see it in the food, we see it in the spirituality, et cetera, et cetera. And campesinos, the first word there, usually refers to literally translates to peasant farmer, and that's a very political identity, and is more commonly used to refer to small scale farmer. I just wanted to point out this picture is taken in on June 15th, when I first arrived there. And yeah, that's important because a lot of the campesinos in this area and globally follow the Catholic calendar of saints. So May 15th is usually the start of the rainy season, or usually the end of when people plant their crops. And as we can see here, it's very dry, rain hasn't hit, and we have a quote from Alba, one of the people's campesinas that I followed, and the story follows. And she says, "We feel an immense sense of gloom when it doesn't rain. Every cloud that passes by gets our hopes up. We pray this will be the day it rains, but it doesn't, at least not here." And she echoes what a lot of campesinos are feeling at the time when they see clouds pass by. As you can see, it's very cloudy, but it'll go like this for days and days without any rain in this region. And we see longer drought periods here, which has led to an increased sense of climate anxiety. And I think another important thing to note is that a lot of campesinos here don't have a sense of climate change. They know that things are changing, their spirituality, their culture, the land, the dirt is changing, but don't necessarily correlate to that to climate change, which isn't a negative thing, but just a really interesting way in how people are interpreting or how people are experiencing climate change. And I think another thing that I really came to, one of the first lessons that I got in being in the field was that climate wasn't the only thing that had changed, and migration was a big part of the story just as much as climate change was. And as you can see here, there's a sign here that reads "Land of Immigrants," that's in like the center of San Lucas. And migration usually, across many countries, migration usually starts within the home country. Migration to a more metropolitan city like Mexico City or the capital of the state, Toluca, was a common practice. However, people would come back for the harvesting, for the start of the cultivation to help with the labor needed. However, in the 1990s up to now, it's become a very common practice to migrate to the US. That has shifted a lot of the demographics in San Lucas. Primarily children, women, and senior citizens are the ones who remain, but who are also the ones who have adapted to cultivate within like these three subgroups. And those who have migrated to the US are still contributing to the cultivation of maize, but now do it through remittances, aka also known as the money sent back home from the home country. And what we see now is a loss of tradition. Here's another quote from Alba, where she says, "When we had absolutely nothing, we'd go to La Milpa, pick elites, and eat them with tortillas made from our maize, or we'd eat tacos de sal, tacos rolled up with just like salt." And a milpa refers to a polyculture system in which both cultivated and uncultivated species coexist. And that was the definition that one of the local professors at an intercultural university had given me. And I really love this explanation because it really encapsulates what the milpa is. As you can see here, there are a lot of cultivated species. You see squash, you see fava beans, you see chiles, you see maize. This is also referred to as like the Three Sisters system. And a lot of people have lost this milpa, this traditional milpa here, because it requires more attention, more care, more labor to it, because you have to dedicate every single day to it. You have to go in and pick weeds and whatnot. And also another part of the uncultivated species is like the human itself and the families who cultivate the land. And additionally, quelites are wild, uncultivated species that are very nutritious and have provided a lot of sustenance to food security throughout many indigenous cultures. And what we've seen over time is a shift towards monocropping, herbicide, and tractors, which has led to soil degradation, low crop yields because of the loss of labor, because things are more expensive. People have to go work, do like labor jobs, wage labor jobs. And these are some of my takeaways. Basically, people are building up this resilience, which is slow, and many have completely abandoned the practice because they need to survive. But others are still cultivating maize. They see a lot of hope. Despite seeing the clouds and seeing the drought, they still continue doing so. And a lot of the campesinos who I talk to have adapted and are experimenting now with their own farming techniques. So instead of putting the milpa all within the entire field, they'll put it on the edges because they can't dedicate that much time, but they still want the land to be rich. And I think one of the most common takeaway is that people are very hesitant and resist GMO corn, and that's really great because Horacio, the professor I spoke to, stated that in developing this native maize, which has been developed within the own family, within the own unit, the maize is growing more resilient. It's the best thing to combat climate change instead of relying on GMO corn. And as Alba and other campesinos are actively doing, there's a lot of sustaining the land and cultural wisdom, passing it on to younger generations, and keeping hope alive. And here I just have some fun.
California is the Golden State. We're known for sunshine, for entertainment, and of course, our beautiful, beautiful beaches. But for one community in the south of California, the beaches have been shut down for over 900 days. There is millions of gallons of pollution entering their waters, and residents wake up sick with headaches, with stomach issues. This is the story of the town of Imperial Beach. My name is Caterina Portella, and I go to San Diego State University. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you guys have heard of Imperial Beach before today? Okay, we have some hands, but not many. That's because Imperial Beach is a town of about 23,000 people, I believe. It is a fairly small town. It's very close-knit, and a lot of people know each other. It is the southernmost town in California, so the very last town before you hit Mexico. And it has been described with the smell of rotten eggs, porta potties, and strong chemicals, some really lovely odors. So let's talk about what is affecting Imperial Beach. Imperial Beach has been affected by some very significant pollution for many years. It's hard to tell exactly when it started, but we know that it's coming from two main sources. One of which being very degraded infrastructure in the nearby city of Tijuana, which many of you have heard of. Tijuana has been growing at an extremely rapid rate. A lot of the new homes in Tijuana have been created as sort of shanty homes, so not very regulated, built alongside the river, and so their sewage is funneled straight into the river. And the second reason, if they do have good plumbing, it'll go to a nearby sewage plant, which has not been renovated since the 90s. So it has fallen into disrepair, and none of that sewage is actually being treated. But that's not to say that Tijuana is the whole problem. On the American side, we also have an unrepaired sewage treatment plant. So all of this nasty, raw sewage is going straight to the river, which then funnels into our beautiful California beaches. Not only is this a problem of people not being able to go swim in the water or enjoy the sand and the sea, It's also a really big health risk, as you can imagine. Not only is it something that's a risk if you touch the water, but even just breathing the air around the water. There was a 2023 study that found that sea spray hitting the shore releases sewage particles into the air. And because of it, the beaches have been closed for 900 days. So we talked about this. There's concrete river walls on the Tijuana side, but not on the Imperial Beach side, so it affects the community of Imperial Beach much stronger. And there's also maquiladoras, which are factories on the Mexican side that also dump chemical waste into the water, so that's another issue to consider. The mayor of Imperial Beach has been trying really hard to get some funding on this and to fix the sewage treatment plant to start, but she's only gotten about half of what she asked for. So this is the context of the story and the context of the problem that's haunting this town, but my story is more on the people and the residents who were all very welcoming and really great people, and since I live in San Diego, it was pretty accessible for me to visit very often. And so I became very close to these people in a sense. So one of the first people I talked to was the Dixons, and they're a couple that owns an urgent care called the South Bay Urgent Care. They told me about seeing more and more neighbors come in with stomach issues, wheezing problems, breathing issues. Even their own kids were starting to have breathing issues. Rochelle Cuevas, she's a mother. She was one of the first people to really open up to me and tell me about, for example, an experience where she couldn't even get out of bed for being so sick from the pollution that she felt that she was literally unable to move. And finally, Darnisha Hunter was here with her cute puppy. She is a grandmother and a new resident of Imperial Beach. A lot of these people I spoke to had been there for a long time, but her being a new resident, she had an interesting perspective as she really loved the community and the tight-knit sense of it and the laid-back ambiance, but it was something new for her to tackle, having to wake up to the stench, which I haven't gotten too far into. But the stench is something that hangs over this town. When I first got out of the car at Imperial Beach, I felt like I was hit in the face by this nasty smell of something rotting, something that's been sitting in the sun, something that is just, it's just disgusting. It's really hard to explain, but this is something that they smell almost every day now. And if I didn't mention, these are all my photos. So this is a group of girls that were practicing a rodeo in South Imperial Beach, which is very rural in this area. And it has a large Mexican population as well as Black and white Americans, so it's a pretty diverse town. So the Dixons, back to the Dixons, who we love, she told me about another aspect of the smell, which is that it's not just a smell, it's a marker of a noxious gas. So when I walked out of the car and I smelled this nastiness, I was actually smelling a toxic gas, which is it is released by decomposing sewage, and it is something that is causing people to have these migraines, to have these stomach issues, and it's something that you really can't avoid. You can put air fresheners, you can put filtration systems, but it's going to be in the air in the end. It's going to find its way into your home. So it's becoming more and more of an issue, and especially for communities like older people, children, and the like. So, like I said, I had a lot of fun covering the story because they're very outspoken about this. It really wasn't hard to get people to talk about it. I made one post on the Imperial Beach Facebook group, like, hey, anybody affected by this problem? And I got so many responses because people are really passionate about it because it's affecting their everyday life. Like, you're breathing a noxious gas. That's something that you're gonna wanna talk about. These baseball games were one of the places where I talk to a lot of people because they become sort of a community gathering place since they no longer have the beach to go to. And it's there that I really got to know the community more and got to know how they're coping with this, because obviously it's a health problem, obviously it's an issue of livelihood, but it's also an issue of, we used to have barbecues by the water, we used to have sandcastle competitions, there used to be seals barking in the water. Now it's quiet. And you walk on the beach in Imperial Beach on a Saturday, and it's quiet. what kind of beach in California is quiet on a Saturday, on a sunny, beautiful Saturday? And finally, something that I didn't get to touch on too much as it wasn't really the focus of my story, but it is a very big issue, is the environmental impact, because in Imperial Beach, there's lovely wetlands, and it's the place of the Tijuana Estuary, which is a nature reserve with many I tried to say fish and birds at the same time. Birds and fish, where they lay their eggs, where they lay their nests, and because the sewage is rotting the water, it takes all the oxygen out of the water, and so all these eggs are dying. And this worker at the Tijuana Estuary, Mr. Crooks, told me that they've seen a really significant decline in the animal population. So what I hope to share with you by sharing this story and writing about it for the Pulitzer Center, which I'm so grateful for, is to just share the story of Imperial Beach more and really convey the seriousness of the noxious gas, of the loss of the beach, of a town of grandparents, of doctors, of families that deserve to have clean air and water. Thank you.
Hi guys, how are you? My name is Jen Wybracki, and I am here representing Syracuse University. And my project today will talk about the industrialization of the Alaskan Arctic. So to get into the historical background, I wanted to start with ANCSA, or the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which is, on the outside, has very admirable points to it, but it is essentially just another effort of the U.S. government to assimilate indigenous people into our way of life. So what it did was it established Alaska Native regional corporations, which are owned by Alaska Native shareholders. And in doing this, it did allow Alaska Natives to reclaim their ownership of their original native lands. And so now they hold power to lease their land to oil companies and then acquire a profit from these oil companies. So it's very different from the lower United States reservation system. So with the passing of ANCSA, the village of Nuiqsut and other villages all across the state were settled, and Nuiqsut was specifically incorporated in 1975, and their native corporation is called Cupik. So Cupik leases the majority of their land to an oil company called ConocoPhillips, which is based in Texas. And an interesting fact is that ConocoPhillips is actually the #1 crude oil producer in the state of Alaska. And its oil fields are only 10 miles outside of the village of Nuiqsut. So that brings me to current day, which is the controversy of the Willow Project. And for those of you that don't know, the Willow Project is a massive, decades-long oil drilling venture by ConocoPhillips that is, again, only 8 miles away from the town of Nuiqsut. And recently, in the past few years, lawsuits have been brought forward by environmentalists to stop this project because it threatens the human health, the environment health, the wildlife's health, and of course, the Inupiat culture of these people in Nuiqsut. So to kind of reel it back to ANCSA, these same things are what ANCSA has been threatening on a larger and broader scale. So to start with the economy, Alaska as a whole is what is called a petrostate, which means essentially that the entire state of Alaska depends on income from oil development. In 2015, the state governor said that almost 90% of the state government's revenue is dependent on this non-renewable resource that has been in decline in the state. So basically, without money from this development, the state economy has to rebuild itself. And then on a village level in Nuiqsut, it's even deeper because they rely on these stipends that ANCSA has established, and they also depend on development projects to keep coming to the area to provide jobs. And ConocoPhillips has taken it a step further because now they're donating a lot of money to the schools, and they provide money for class field trips, so the community is becoming more and more dependent on it. So moving on to health, this is what my project largely focused on, but the community of Nuiqsut is facing a lot of issues with respiratory health. But also we see issues with mental health, environmental health, and again, the cultural health of the community are also largely at risk because of the industrialization. It is also important to note that a lot of other villages on the North Slope of Alaska in the Arctic Circle all see benefits from ConocoPhillips oil activities, but Nuiqsut right now is the only village that's exposed to these toxins, being only 10 miles away. And then finally, politics. So at a village level, the same leaders that are holding office at a village level are the same ones who are shareholders in these native corporations. So this leads to complexities because then a lot of these same people are being paid off by industry, specifically ConocoPhillips in this case. So being paid off by the company, they don't speak to journalists and they don't speak out about their loss of land, their loss of culture, and how it affects their health. And then I also wanted to note that living in a small village, especially with issues like Willow, can mean you're at the center of complexity because you have your village government, and the village of Nuiqsut is only 500 residents. And then you have the North Slope Borough, which is a government that oversees all of the villages in the North Slope. And then you have the state, the federal governments, and then your private investor shareholders all having a say in what goes on the Northern Slope. So with good leadership, that means that these tiers are great. But other times with Willow, it means it can be resting on very small scale decisions and it gets very complicated. So to shift gears to my main character, Rosemary is now 50 years old, and she's one of the few that is college educated in this area. And she was a community health aide in the community for 15 years when development started in around 2000. So she was someone that witnessed a lot of the health issues that changed over the past few decades. It is also important to note that she married into the community 2 decades ago, so a lot of people are now using that against her because they're trying to silence her. But she has family here, and she's, again, been living here for over 2 decades, so it's very hard for her to have to cope with that. So I was interested in interviewing her at first because at the time of the Willow Project lawsuits, she was the mayor of Nuiqsut, and she was, again, a loud voice in the community that brought these arguments against Willow to the surface. So I contacted her, and she drove me around the oil fields, and she shared stories about how her personal family's health has been affected. And then she also shared a story that while she was mayor, ConocoPhillips turned off the community's access to gas for a whole week to heat their homes and to fuel their cars in the dead of an Alaskan winter. People have attempted to kill her on 4 separate occasions for speaking out against the oil industry. And exactly 1 year ago, though, she had to step down from her position as mayor for family reasons. So she was replaced. And a month after she was replaced, the village of Nuiqsut retracted their opposition for the Willow Project. So now, new drill sites are currently being installed. The first picture is the Willow Project literally being installed while I was there. And unlike other projects, Rosemary told me that this is the one that's going to push the village's health past the tipping point. And the community, again, is starting to turn against her and continue to turn against her as she continues to advocate for their health. So, again, as I mentioned in the first slide, this is obviously a very complex issue. And I saw that when I was there because anytime I would mention that I interviewed her name to anyone else in the community, they would scoff or roll their eyes or say that she's a liar, nothing she says is true. And so I asked Rosemary about this, and obviously she had told me she gets this reaction often, being one of the few people that will speak against oil companies. She also told me that she has suspicions of the village being placed under gag orders by ConocoPhillips now. And it's also important to note that Rosemary does agree with a lot of what they're saying. She sees the economic potential and the benefits, and she understands their fear speaking out. But at this point, she believes the community has nothing if they don't have their own health. And again, I saw this when I reached out to local government entities. They would say stuff like, no one in the city feels comfortable talking about this subject because if it gets twisted, it would put them in a very dangerous position. So this left me thinking, what now? If this whole community has chosen this path, what is my role as a journalist and what is our role to help this community? And the last thing I wanted to say was to leave you with a quote that the mayor had told me when I was talking to him about this subject. He said, "Is there a balance to even be found between our health and the development? Because if it's so, what is it and how can it be found?" Thank you so much.
Thanks again to all of our panelists. I'll start by asking if any of you have questions for one another.
I think it should. My question would be, what kind of food do they eat in Greenland? What were you eating?
They should be working. Can you make sure it's turned on?
Hello? Oh, now it is working. Sorry. Wake up. I actually got invited by one of my sources to go to her house. Oh, the...
This one isn't really working. Well, I can project my voice. My question was, what sort of food do they eat in Greenland, jokingly? I was mostly asking what was like the culture? Like, what was it like acclimating to the culture in Greenland?
Yeah, it was really cool. I actually got invited by one of my sources to something called a Cafe Meek, which is like an open house, and it's very common there. They basically just like open their doors and anyone can come in, and they have cakes and they have traditional Greenlandic food, and they get together and they drink coffee and they chat. And so I went to one and I made it a goal to like try the Greenlandic food. I hate to admit I'm not a big fan of seafood, which is primarily what they eat there, but I did. There's like reindeer, which isn't seafood, but then they had like seal, they had whale, they had different types of fish. It wasn't my favorite, but I tried it.
Any other panelist questions? All right, to our audience, when you get the microphone, if you could please stand up, say who you are, and then ask your question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Stephanie Haynes. I'm with the Christian Science Monitor, and this is a question about Mexico. And I was wondering, you mentioned migration, and I was wondering whether you saw in your reporting that the climate situation had prompted the migration, or whether you thought it was the other way around, that some of the migration had led to the degradation of the fields there. Thanks. And by the way, you guys have amazing projects. It's been awesome to listen to them.
Thank you for your question. So I actually spoke to data scientists who mapped migration and climate change and like soil degradation, and he did find a positive correlation between it. He says like the paper has like changed now in the past like 3-4 years, but ultimately a lot of the migration has left. A lot of the migration has left people losing their traditions, so they lose traditional farming tools, they lose traditional farming methods, such as the milpa. And the milpa is very rich in nutrients because it lets this jungle of uncultivated and cultivated species to thrive under the supervision of like humans. Humans are taking care of it. They also have animal manure. Animals are also like, there's chickens roaming around and everything. But nowadays, because people have migrated outside of the country, have also like permanently migrated outside of the town, have gone to Mexico City, have gone to Tijuana to go live there permanently. There aren't a lot of people to sustain the amount of time and labor needed for your livestock, for different like weed pickings and whatnot. So that was the argument that I was trying to make, that migration has led to this loss of tradition. And the loss of tradition has also made it very difficult to combat climate change. Yeah.
Tristan. Hi, my name is Nora. I go to Penn. And my question was for Jennifer. I was wondering, when you were doing your interviews, knowing that they're within the singular community, there's so much dispute over, like, basically the facts and who's right, who's wrong, what's good and what's bad. How did you sort of approach the question of fact checking and testimony and sort of deciding what is actually true in this sort of narratives where people are basically ad hominem attacking each other?
Is it working? Okay.
Yes.
So that's a very good question. It is something that I'm very lucky that the mentor that the Pulitzer Center actually gave me was very helpful with. And in one word, I want to just say be very transparent about what I had been hearing to all my sources, and also approaching every interview by saying whatever you say can be off record, because it's a very sensitive topic. And I know in my presentation I made it seem like they're all fighting, but when I was there, I was lucky enough to experience one of their cultural dances I was invited to by the mayor. So when we're not talking about politics, they are still a community. But with fact checking, it was very difficult because, like you said, everyone's kind of arguing and going against each other. So it was very difficult. I kind of used a lot of articles that had already been written, but I also had to use my news judgment in the community, and again work with my mentor. And then my final deliverable is kind of going to stray away from the complications of it and kind of just talk about the issues of the health that the industry has caused. So it was very difficult at first. But yeah, being very transparent about everything was definitely key to that.
All right, my name is Dami, and I'm from the Missouri School of Journalism. Great presentation, and I have a question for Maddie, and maybe any other person that wants to answer. So climate change and environment is, a very important topic, and I particularly like how you mentioned that the people are often neglected in terms of how climate change, how they're being impacted by climate change. So I just wanted to ask, what solution approaches did you take in your report, and to effect policy change, and even beyond publishing on Pulitzer Center? Are you also exploring other options to actually, let people know what's happening, and also maybe people, the stakeholders as well?
Yeah, so I definitely want to look at different ways I can distribute the work that would be beneficial to the community. I think anytime I do work, I always try to figure out kind of the human side of it, because I think that's what makes people feel empathetic and care about issues. And so when I was looking at, Greenland and climate change, I didn't see a whole lot about how the people were kind of intimately experiencing the effects of climate change. So when I went there, that was kind of my opener question for everyone I spoke with, was just like, have you seen the environment change? How is that affecting you? How has your livelihoods been affected? And just kind of letting them just talk. And through that, they shared a lot about how their ways of life have changed, which I thought was very profound. So I definitely wanted to center on that with my work. And then I guess changes specifically, I know that there is some legislation, I believe, that from the government to kind of provide more assistance to people who are economically affected by climate change. But beyond that, from what I saw, it was a lot of like community-centered approaches, like going into the communities and figuring out how they can help prevent suicide and how they can help preserve their culture in the face of climate change. So it seems very community-led from my perspective. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Hi, I'm Audrey. I'm from American University. And anyone who can take it who you think applies to, but this is something I've thought about in other reporting in the past, and I'm curious to know what you think about like when kind of the complex colonial / imperial histories of a place relate to the story, how you think about incorporating it, if you incorporate it, how you like talk about that, and if you talk about it.
I can kind of answer this question because Puerto Rico has a really interesting relationship with the U.S. being a territory, and that was hugely impactful on its ability to recover from Hurricane Maria. So being a territory, it essentially has some of its own legislative body, but it is really reliant on the U.S., but it doesn't get many of the privileges that its citizens get, and also kind of funding support. One particular thing that was the biggest hurdle at the beginning was the Jones Act, essentially that only U.S. Ships could dock at the ports, and that basically blockaded a bunch of aid from reaching residents. So they were able to, after a period, kind of put a stay on that act and allow aid to get in. But it's kind of like inherent in their challenge to deal with climate crisis being beholden to the U.S. And they're kind of in the midst of their own kind of like political conflict, trying to decide amongst the citizens what to do, whether they want to pursue statehood, stay as a territory, or become independent. And that will hugely impact its climate future, how it can actually receive support from the U.S. or become independent and potentially be even more vulnerable. And this is kind of like a question I have in larger research that I do at school about like small island states, but also countries in the global south. There's like a new loss and damage fund to help countries that are affected by climate disasters and to provide funding for them. But if on a small scale, residents aren't even able to access these funds, and in a way they might become beholden to like global north countries that are providing the funding, what does that mean for the climate future? How independent can these countries be and be able to kind of like forge their own path forward if they're reliant on other countries?
Okay. I also wanted to answer this question quickly because obviously Alaska deals with American indigenous populations. And so for my article that I'm writing for the Pulitzer Center, I had to dedicate not a significant, but a few sentences about the history of the American Indian and Indian boarding schools and a lot of that history because the generations that are now 50s, 60s, they saw a lot of their family taken to boarding schools and they had to assimilate. And they obviously have a lot of generational trauma. And something I didn't get to include was I was able to interview a board member of Cupid Corporation, and all of her brothers went to boarding schools, and now they are all board members of Cupid. And for her, that's a place of pride because they were able to go through this horrible trauma of assimilation and come out on top by running these corporations and getting an income and providing for their families. So although it's complicated, it's very important to know that they are, trying to figure it out now in the present day after healing from generational trauma. So I've had to include that a lot into my research.
Hi, Una from Wake Forest. This is also a question for all of you beautiful people, and it also kind of piggybacks on what you were just saying. I kind of felt an echo in a lot of your presentations of like this push and pull between leaving home, maybe to somewhere better because of the effect of climate change on a specific community, or staying and fighting it out and trying to make do. And I guess, I don't know if this is exactly a question, but I guess I'm just curious, like when you guys were reporting, how did you experience that? And did you feel like people were more compelled to stay and fight or leave and then maybe perhaps come back to fight with like different kinds of education or opportunities? And was there kind of like an age or cultural discrepancy there? It's a lot of questions bundled in one, but thank you.
So I actually looked into a lot of this for my pre-reporting because that was a very interesting aspect of it that I wanted to look into. And when I was on the ground, I saw that a lot of people didn't necessarily want to leave. And I kept asking, if you guys can all acknowledge that this is an issue that's 8 miles away, how come? And it's just a really big question because then they obviously have to give up their whole culture and their whole community in this area. And similar to what Maddie said during her presentation they've lived in the Arctic, they've persevered, and they are very strongly in belief that they will be able to adapt and make it through this challenge as well. And Rosemary shared a story about her son and his wife had to leave town while she gave birth to her child, but they did end up coming back up because it's their home. So yeah, I'm glad that you brought that point up.
Yeah, this was a conversation that came up in my reporting too. Because personally, if I was living somewhere that had a stench of sewage over it, I would want to leave. But I found that not only were they really stubborn, but it was it was almost like a community bonding that came out of pushing for change. That the community of Imperial Beach really came together when it came time to having, for example, like panels or discussions where they would talk about how it's affecting their lives and what can they do next. Actually, I didn't really hear too much about people leaving unless it was like that they had young kids or something, like something that was really pressing, because it seemed like a lot of people really felt that change was going to happen soon and that they felt that there was small increments of progress being made. And so it was pretty inspiring to see that. I spoke to actually the mayor of Imperial Beach, and she had just so many ideas of how they can get the attention of the federal government, what have they done in the past. And although a lot of people were pretty burnt out from the effort of trying to gain attention on it, they actually recently filed a lawsuit against, I need to read further into it, but it was something that happened like just this week, that they filed a lawsuit, I'm pretty sure against like a government agency for not, putting the funding that they were supposed to towards the treatment plants on the American side. So it's something that people really connected over and really are pushing for. And it seems to be making some change.
Hello, I'm Lauren from Boston University, and my question was specifically for Natalia, and I was curious about how locals you spoke to in Puerto Rico received your reporting coming years after Hurricane Maria. You spoke about this vacuum in reporting, and so were people eager to still talk about it, or like relieved to have someone covering it years after?
Thank you for your question. I think one of the biggest things, in short, yes. But one of the biggest things that I noticed is how actively engaged people are around the issue of climate change. I think in the US and amongst young people, but also like older generations, it can feel very disheartening because people see it as a distant problem, or maybe they don't believe in climate change. But in Puerto Rico, because it's so like imminent, they are engaged in not only like coming up with the solutions, but building community around it. I did encounter some challenges because it was through the government program. I think there was some apprehension to talk about the actual details of the process that they were going through. I would go on the Department of Housing's page, and there were dozens of comments, like very angry comments about how long they had to wait. And like, I remember stories of people whose family members had passed away and they no longer were able to, it's like dimming on me. so they weren't even able to move back into the home. And then when I would reach out to these people over Facebook Messenger, it would be radio silence. And I would like follow up with like dozens of people. So there's this balance between like people are absolutely willing to talk about their experience with Maria. I mean, among my own family, people have very visceral experiences with it, and everyone on the island has their own story. But when it came to the specifics of the actual recovery and the programs, I think it was a more sensitive topic because people definitely have a distrust and fear that they might receive backlash, or that their application might be delayed, or that they might not get timely like support. So there is kind of an apprehension in that regard.
Hello, Jaquel again. I'm from Houston-Tillotson University. I have a question for Katarina. Is that correct? So recently, when I was actually in school, I just graduated. In my environmental biology class, we learned about something called Cancer Alley, which is a place where the rivers were being infected by factories that were being placed by the rivers, which created deadly toxins for the community. So that made me think of your project, and I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on factories being placed by areas where people are living, and what can be done about that issue?
Question, thank you. So I didn't get to mention this in my project, but I actually did talk to a number of people from Tijuana, because the project mainly focused on Imperial Beach, but I felt like it still had a lot to do with TJ, especially that's where a lot of the factories were and where this pollution's, a portion of it was coming from. And they were telling me that on that side, there was a lot of kind of shanty villages that were being built around the factories because people would just go to work and then go live in their little home that they had built right there. And it was something that people gathered around, and they actually, I think a lot of people just weren't really aware of how much environmental degradation was coming about due to the sewage, because I briefly mentioned this, but there was basically many decades ago, I think it was the 60s, there was a conversation of should we put concrete on either side of the Tijuana River. If any of you guys have been to LA, the LA River has concrete on either side, and it looks really nasty. And so they were going to do that to the Tijuana River, but Americans were like, no, the climate, so they didn't end up doing that. But on the Mexican side, they actually did. So because they have this concrete on their side of the river, it actually doesn't affect them as much because obviously the chemicals and sewage just kind of flow past, and it's not leaching into the dirt or the air as much. But it is really sad to see that people on the other side of the board that didn't really agree to any of the factories being there or agree to there being no fortification against sewage, they have to deal with the really nasty part of the effects. I feel like there's just not a lot that people on the American side can do because it is something that's happening in another country. And so the mayor of Imperial Beach and the mayor of Tijuana have been in talks. But it is really unfortunate because it's something that closes off a place that once used to be of gathering, the beach, the river. There, I spoke to a lot of people, especially older residents, remember like playing in the river or riding their horses into the water, because it is like a rural area.